Picture this. You're standing in the middle of an Olympic swimming pool, except there's no water. The lane markers are still painted on the concrete floor, sun-bleached from years of exposure to the Mediterranean sky above. Diving blocks are still bolted to the edge, rusted solid, the Olympic Rings logo barely visible under a layer of corrosion. Spray painted across the wall behind you is a single word, a piece of graffiti whose story has been lost to time, left there by someone long after the last swimmer climbed out. Then you look up. Above you, a roof that once sheltered the world's best athletes from the Athens summer heat is missing entire panels. Sky is visible through the gaps. Pigeons move through the space where record-breaking performances used to happen. And the specific story behind how a 17-day sporting event became a symbol of one country's deeper financial problems and what it means for every city that has hosted the Olympics since is something you genuinely need to hear. Estimates for what Athens spent to host the 2004 Games range from around $11 billion to more than $15 billion, depending on what you count and whether broader infrastructure and security costs are included. Years later, several of the venues built for those games sit abandoned, fenced off, or rarely used. Olympic officials have maintained that the majority remain in some form of operation. The reality, as so often with these stories, sits somewhere in between and is more complicated than either version suggests. We're going to look at how a country that built some of the most ambitious sports infrastructure in modern Olympic history ended up paying for it for the next 2 decades, and why some of those venues were never going to have a meaningful future once the closing ceremony ended. To understand how Athens got here, you have to go back much further than 2004. You have to go back to 1896, the year Athens hosted the very first modern Olympic Games. The original Games were modest by any contemporary standard. 14 countries, fewer than 300 athletes, a handful of sporting events held across a city that was, at the time, still finding its footing as the capital of a recently independent nation. But they were a statement of intent, a claim that Greece, as the birthplace of the ancient Olympics, had a permanent and special relationship with the Games. For more than a century, Athens wanted to bring the Olympics home again. When the city finally won the right to host the 2004 Games, awarded by the International Olympic Committee in 1997, it was received as a correction of a long-standing historical oversight. Athens had bid for the Centennial Games in 1996 and lost to Atlanta, a decision that caused genuine outrage across Greece. The 2004 award felt like a vindication. And it came with an enormous task. 7 years to build or renovate dozens of venues, modernize the city's transport network with new metro lines and highways, open a new international airport, and create the infrastructure needed to host an event that would bring the entire world's attention to a city of 4 million people for 17 days. The original budget projections were far lower than what Greece eventually spent. By most estimates, the final cost ran to roughly double the early projections, with the acceleration of spending concentrated in the final 2 years, when it became clear that construction was running dangerously behind schedule. By 2000, the International Olympic Committee issued a serious warning that Athens risked losing the Games altogether if the organization did not drastically improve its pace. The warning was not issued quietly. It was public, pointed, and deeply embarrassing for a country that had spent 3 years celebrating its Olympic future. Athens responded by throwing money at the problem, overtime, crews working through the night, materials imported at premium cost, contractors brought in from across Europe to hit deadlines that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The pressure in those final years was extraordinary. Every week brought new concerns, new delays, new questions from the international press about whether a city that had been awarded the Games specifically for its symbolic significance could actually deliver them on time. It delivered. By opening night in August 2004, the venues were finished. The Athens Olympics were, by almost every measure, a spectacular success. The security operation, massive in the post-September 11th environment, ran without incident. The sporting program produced memorable performances. The atmosphere across the city, with Greeks watching their home country host the world, was electric. The final bill ran far beyond what anyone had originally projected, and the real story of what those billions bought and what they didn't began the moment the closing ceremony ended. For most Olympic host cities, the plan is to convert venues into long-term public use after the Games. Community pools, training centers, concert venues, public parks. Athens had plans like that on paper, legacy documents, proposals for redevelopment, the language of sustainable post-Games use that every host city produces in the years before the opening ceremony. For many of the biggest venues, it never happened. The reason comes down to a problem that was visible in the original planning but never fully resolved. The expectation was that venues would eventually pay for themselves through future events, sponsorships, and commercial redevelopment. But far less of that materialized than planners had hoped, and in several cases, the venues had been built for sports that had almost no professional presence in Greece, which made the prospect of future use nearly impossible from the start. Consider what was built: an Olympic softball stadium for a sport that Greece had no domestic league to sustain. A baseball venue, the same problem. A canoe and kayak slalom center that cost roughly $80 million to construct, with purpose-built water channels and specialist infrastructure that serves almost no function outside of competition. A beach volleyball venue at Faliro with bleachers for 10,000 spectators, built on a site that was never going to attract the kind of regular programming needed to justify its existence. Each of these venues was built to Olympic standard, which is to say built to a level of specification and cost that only makes sense if you are hosting the world's best athletes in front of a global television audience. Once the global television audience moves on, that level of specification becomes a liability, expensive to maintain, difficult to repurpose, and generating almost no revenue. The maintenance costs for the unused venues alone ran into the tens of millions of dollars annually, not a one-time cost, a recurring annual cost year after year for facilities that hosted almost nothing and earned almost nothing. And then, 4 years after the closing ceremony, the global financial crisis arrived. Greece entered the 2008 financial crisis carrying a public debt that had been growing quietly for years, driven by a combination of factors that long predated the Olympics, including pension obligations, public sector spending, and a tax system that collected far less than it was owed. The Olympic spending had added to that burden without creating the economic returns that had been projected. Tourism increased, but not at the levels originally forecast. The promised foreign investment in Olympic venues largely failed to materialize. When the sovereign debt crisis began in earnest around 2010, Greece needed international bailouts to avoid defaulting on its debt. The austerity measures that followed, cuts to public services, pension reductions, tax increases, affected millions of people across the country for more than a decade. Greece's national debt ballooned to over 170% of GDP at its peak. Unemployment climbed above 27%. An entire generation of young Greeks left the country. The Olympics did not cause this. It is important to say that, clearly, Greece's fiscal problems had structural causes that went far beyond a 2-week sporting event. But the 2004 Games added a significant layer of public spending that produced limited long-term economic returns, and the venues left behind became the most visible symbols of that mismatch between investment and outcome. Numbers tell the story venue by venue. The Olympic softball stadium, built for a sport with no Greek league to sustain it, abandoned within years of the closing ceremony. Its field overtaken by weeds, the dugouts rusting quietly in the Mediterranean heat. The beach volleyball venue at Faliro, bleachers for 10,000 spectators, sitting empty under the sun, the sand courts cracked and dry, the banners from 2004 long since removed by wind and time. The Olympic canoe and kayak slalom center, which cost roughly $80 million to build. Today the water channels sit empty, concrete walls stained where water once flowed during competitions, watched by thousands of people who are now scattered across the world. A 2014 Reuters investigation found many of the original venues abandoned. fenced off, or barely used. Olympic officials, for their part, have maintained that the majority of the venues remained in some form of operation. The truth sits somewhere between these two accounts, which is itself the story. A decade after the Games, two credible parties were still disagreeing about the basic facts of what the legacy had actually been. And that's where Athens becomes more than just an Olympic story. By every measure of the event itself, the 2004 Athens Games were a success. The competition was real. The performances were genuine. The atmosphere for those 17 days was everything the Olympics is supposed to be. Athens did not bankrupt Greece, but the 2004 Olympics became one of the clearest symbols of the country's deeper problem. A pattern of ambitious public spending, weak long-term planning, and expensive infrastructure built for a moment rather than for the decades that would follow. The failure happened in the years nobody was watching, in the gap between the world's cameras are here and the world's cameras left. Athens spent a fortune building for a 17-day audience and never fully built a plan for the other 51 weeks of every year that came after. This pattern did not begin with Athens, and it did not end there. Beijing hosted the 2008 Games and left behind venues that have struggled to find consistent use. Rio hosted in 2016 and produced some of the most widely photographed scenes of Olympic abandonment in the history of the Games. Athens became one of the first modern host cities where the gap between the promise of the Games and the reality of the aftermath was impossible to ignore, partly because Greece was a smaller country with fewer resources to absorb the cost, and partly because what came after the Games was so much harder than what came before. The pools are still there. At some venues, even the Olympic rings are still bolted to the gates, rust spreading slowly across the 5 faded circles, a little more each year. For 17 days in the summer of 2004, this city was the center of the entire world's attention. Every camera, every flag, every cheering crowd pointed at Athens. The ancient city that gave the world the Olympics had brought them home, and for those 17 days, it felt like a story with a perfect ending. What's left now is a series of answers to a question the closing ceremony never asked. What happens to a dream once the world stops watching? The Games lasted just 17 days. Their legacy lasted decades.